Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Israel Brief, proudly brought to you by Lay of the Land. I'm your host, Rolene Marks, and as always, I bring you the latest news headlines from Israel. And last week we spoke quite intensively about the build up to what would have been the Million Man March or Land Day protests that were going to take place on the border between Gaza and Israel over the weekend. Now, before the protesters or marchers were due together, Israel and Egypt were in discussions with Hamas to try and stop the protest from turning potentially violent and very, very destructive. So basically, about 40,000 protesters gathered along the border between Gaza and Israel on Saturday. And as per the stipulations by the Egyptians and by the Israelis, managed to keep protesters a couple of hundred meters away from the fence. This is not to say that there weren't those elements who did try and infiltrate, and at one point 2 8-year-old boys were sent over with knives, and they were brought back safely by the IDF to their families in Gaza. Now, prior to this, and I actually have to take a minute to commend the conduct of the Israeli Defense Forces. Not only was their conduct during the protest absolutely exemplary, but their social media and the way that they managed to keep the world updated was absolutely brilliant. So the IDF all through Saturday morning was warning the residents of Gaza not to engage in violence, not to come close to the fence, warning them for their own safety. And at one point, one of the IDF spokespeople in Arabic actually appealed to the mothers of Gaza to please keep their children safe, because we know that Hamas are prone to using children and women and the elderly as well as the disabled as human shields for maximum civilian casualties. The protest was relatively peaceful. A few incidents, there were about 200 people wounded and 2 Palestinians were killed. And this is because the IDF had to use or had to respond to incendiary devices, to burning tires, and to projectiles and rocks being thrown at troops. It's a situation that could have been potentially catastrophic, but given the event and given the build-up, actually managed to be not as bad as anticipated. The Ronen Manelis of the IDF actually commended Hamas in their unprecedented ability to ensure that there wasn't as much violence as expected. And it was noted that while Hamas head Ismail Haniyeh was there, so were the Egyptian delegation and so were Hamas marshals in orange vests. So this is quite unprecedented, almost, I don't know, could you call it praise from the IDF, although no sooner had the protest ended than Tseva Adom, or the code red, sounded in the south of Israel as rockets were fired from the strip into Israel. Thank goodness nobody was hurt and there was no destruction to property. And yesterday as well, rockets and mortars fired from the strip into Israel. And as we stand at the moment, troops are still on the border with Gaza. The situation is still tense, and we are hoping that this week will be a lot more quiet than last week. Now, looking at England, and I thought it was an April the 1st joke, but turns out it isn't. The former mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, who is no stranger to being in trouble for making anti-Semitic comments, once again stuck his foot in his mouth and has managed to offend by saying that it is okay or not anti-Semitic to hate Israeli Jews. Really, Ken? It's never okay to hate anybody. But apparently it's totally okay, according to Ken Livingstone, to hate Israeli Jews. Just a reminder to our viewers that Ken Livingstone, who was the former mayor of London, was suspended from the Labour Party several years ago for saying that Hitler would probably identify as Zionist. So Ken just a word of caution from us to you: if you don't want to go on profoundly offending Jewish people and all sensible people around the world, maybe you need to refrain from commenting on anti-Semitism. It is obviously you need to remove your foot from your mouth. And in other news, Israel has dispatched IsraAid, one of the extraordinary NGOs that flies around the world to give aid and to help with recovery at a time of natural disasters. And Mozambique and other parts of southern Africa around the area have been hit very, very hard by Cyclone Idai. And it's created tremendous loss of life and loss of much needed infrastructure like water, like food, like medicine. And thank goodness for the extraordinary efforts of organizations like IsraAid. And here I also have to mention members of the South African Jewish community who have been collecting aid. I know students on campus today have been collecting stuff that can be sent to Mozambique to help people there. We thank IsraAid and commend them on their extraordinary efforts. Now, don't forget, you can check out Lay of the Land online at www.layoftheland.online, and you can read Dave Kaplan's intriguing article about Entebbe and its reference to 2 South Africans who were involved. Also, join our growing Facebook community by liking or following us on Facebook, and don't forget that you can click on the subscribe button below to receive your edition of the Israel Brief. I'm Rolene Marks, and this is the Israel Brief on the 1st of April. We'll chat again to you tomorrow.